Today we're looking at an example of specialization in trade. One way to specialize is to specialize according to who has the comparative advantage. So let's consider the example where we have two businesses or countries. We'll call one Rings and the other Potter. Well, the average worker in Rings can make one broomstick or 4 swords. The average worker in Potter can make 6 broomsticks or 3 swords. To determine how we benefit from specializing in trading, we construct the production possibility frontier. If each worker in Rings can make 1 broomstick or 4 swords, and we have 100 workers, then our 100 workers could either produce 100 broomsticks, which we denote with the point here, or 400 swords, which we denote with the point here. The production possibility frontier shows the combinations of swords and broomsticks that Rings can make, so we can connect the 2 points as you see here. Everything along the production possibility frontier are combinations of swords and broomsticks that Rings could make. We can also construct the production possibility frontier for Potter. If the average worker at Potter can construct 6 broomsticks or 3 swords, and we have 100 workers in Potter, then a total of 600 broomsticks, denoted at this point here, could be produced by Potter, or Potter could spend all of its time and resources making swords, and 300 swords would be produced. If we connect these 2 points, we get the production possibility frontier. This shows all the combinations of swords and broomsticks that Potter could make. They could make only swords and make 300, make only broomsticks and make 600, or some combination in between. To see how we are better off through trade, we must pick a point along the production possibility frontier for Potter to produce swords and broomsticks. So let's suppose that Potter will produce 300 broomsticks and 150 swords, and we denote that point with the dot here. I'll write that down as well so we can remember that later. 300 broomsticks and 150 swords. This means that Potter is producing a total of 450 goods. We also need to pick a production point for Rings. That is how many swords and broomsticks they will produce. Now let's suppose that Rings decides to produce 50 broomsticks and 200 swords. Notice this point is on the production possibility frontier. Rings could choose any of the points along the production possibility frontier. We have simply just picked one, where Rings produces 50 broomsticks and 200 swords. Therefore, Rings will produce a total of 250 goods. If we combine that with what Potter is producing, the 2 groups produce 700 goods combined. Before we can have specialization in trade, and to see who's better off from trading, we need to determine who has the comparative advantage. So first we have to determine what the opportunity costs are for Rings and for Potter in making broomsticks and swords. The opportunity costs can be obtained from the production possibility frontier by looking at the slope, the trade-off between broomsticks and swords. We can also use the table for the average product per worker to tell us the opportunity cost. So we need to find the opportunity cost for Rings in broomsticks. Well, for Rings to make a broomstick in the same time using the same resources, they're able to either make 1 broomstick or 4 swords. So the opportunity cost for Rings to make a broomstick will be 4 swords. The opportunity cost for Rings to make a sword will be 1/4 of a broomstick, because in the time it takes to make one broomstick, they're making 4 swords. In the time it takes to make one sword, they're making 1/4 of a broomstick. We also need to find the opportunity cost for Potter. In the time it takes Potter to make one broomstick, we need to know how many swords they can make. Well, according to the average product per worker, in Potter, the average worker can make 6 broomsticks or 3 swords. So in the time and using the resources it takes to make 6 broomsticks, they can make 3 swords. The opportunity cost for Potter then will be 3/6 swords. This is equal to 1/2 of a sword. In the time it takes them to make 6 broomsticks, they can make 3 swords, or in the time it takes to make 1 broomstick, they make 1/2 of a sword. The opportunity cost for Potter in swords is the time and energy it takes to make 1 sword. They are giving up how many broomsticks? Well, if they can make 3 swords in the same amount of time they make 6 broomsticks, then 6 divided by 3 broomsticks, or 2 broomsticks, is the opportunity cost for Potter to make a sword. To determine who has the comparative advantage, we have to look at who has the lowest opportunity cost. When it comes to making broomsticks, Rings has an opportunity cost of 4 swords, and Potter has an opportunity cost of 1/4 of a sword. So Potter has the lowest opportunity cost in making broomsticks, and therefore they have the comparative advantage. When it comes to making swords, Rings has an opportunity cost of 1/4 of a broomstick, and Potter has an opportunity cost of 2 broomsticks. Rings has the lower opportunity cost, and since they have to give up less to make swords, they have the comparative advantage in making swords, and Rings should be the one making swords. If Potter has the comparative advantage in broomsticks, then Potter will only make broomsticks. Therefore, Potter will make 600 broomsticks. If Rings has the comparative advantage in swords, then Rings will only make swords. They are able to make a total of 400 swords. We now need to determine an appropriate trade rate. According to David Ricardo, businesses or countries are better off if they specialize in what they have the comparative advantage in, and then they trade, when the trade rate is between the 2 opportunity costs. In other words, we need a trade rate that is between 1 broomstick for 1/2 a sword and 1 broomstick for 4 swords. We could also look at it in terms of swords. 1 sword for 1/4 of a broomstick, and 1 sword for 2 broomsticks. We need a trade rate that is between 1 broomstick for 1/2 a sword and 1 broomstick for 4 swords. One example of this would be to choose 1 broomstick for 1 sword. Notice that 1 broomstick for 1 sword is between both 1 broomstick for 1/2 a sword and 1 broomstick for 4 swords. And since we could also look at it as 1 sword for 1 broomstick, it is between 1 sword for 1/4 of a broomstick and 1 sword for 2 broomsticks. To see how Potter is better off by specializing in broomsticks and then trading at a rate of 1 broomstick for 1 sword, we start at this point here where Potter is creating 600 broomsticks. And we look at how many swords can be gained if Potter takes their broomsticks and sells some of them to Rings. So let's suppose that Potter takes 100 of their broomsticks and sells them to Rings. That leaves Potter with 500 broomsticks, but it means that they receive 100 swords. Notice that that point is outside the production possibility frontier. Potter could also choose to take 200 of their broomsticks, so they go from 600 to 400. They now only have 400 broomsticks, but for the 200 broomsticks they sell to Rings, they're able to get 200 swords. Notice that this point is also outside the production possibility frontier. We could draw a line illustrating all these combinations of broomsticks and swords that Potter would be able to consume that they otherwise would not have if they did not trade. If there is no trade, then we're forced to consume along the production possibility frontier. We can only consume what we produce. But if we specialize and trade, we are able to consume more broomsticks and swords than we otherwise would. We can see that Rings also benefits from specializing and trading. Rings will produce 400 swords. If they take 100 of those swords, they're left with 300, and they sell those 100 swords to Potter, then Rings will receive 100 broomsticks. So now they're able to consume 300 swords and 100 broomsticks. If Rings takes another 100 swords, they're now left with 200, and they sell those swords to Potter, then Rings will have a total of 200 swords and 200 broomsticks to consume. If Rings sells all of its swords to Potter, it is able to buy 400 broomsticks. We can connect these points, put them on a line, and you can see all of the possible consumption points Rings can consume. Rings is able to consume more swords and more broomsticks than they would if there was no trade. They are able to consume more swords and more broomsticks than they are able to produce themselves. Rings is better off by specializing and trading. One possible consumption point for Rings when there was no trade was for Rings to consume 50 broomsticks and 200 swords. This point was on the production possibility frontier because with no trade you consume what you produce. But with specialization and trade, Rings is able to consume such combinations as 200 broomsticks and 200 swords. So Rings goes from consuming 250 goods to 400 goods. We can see that Rings is better off.